On a Wednesday morning in 1973, a woman named Margaret Hollis walked the length of Briggate in Leeds and spent money in 11 different shops. She bought a pound of back bacon from the butcher, collected a dress she'd had taken in at the alterations shop, bought a birthday card, a pair of school socks, a packet of Elastoplast, 2 ounces of tobacco for her husband, a cream slice from the baker's that she ate on a bench outside, and enough vegetables for 3 days. She carried everything home in a tartan shopping trolley. She knew the name of the person who served her in 8 of those 11 shops. She had no car, she needed none. Everything was there, on the same street, within 10 minutes' walk of her front door. That version of the British high street, not a leisure destination, not a brand experience, not a managed retail environment, just a street full of shops run by people who lived nearby and sold things the neighbourhood actually needed, functioned as the social and commercial spine of every town in Britain for the better part of a century. It worked because it had been built around the way people actually lived, and it was destroyed, not by accident, not by the invisible hand of the market doing what markets do, but by a sequence of specific decisions made by specific people, some of whom became very rich in the process. A street that ran itself. The high street in the 1970s was not a quaint relic. It was a working infrastructure. Every town in Britain, from market towns with 3,000 people to industrial cities with 300,000, had a version of it. A concentrated stretch where the things a household needed in a week could be obtained without a car, without a trolley the size of a small boat, and without walking through a building designed to keep you inside it for as long as possible. The range of what was there would surprise anyone who came of age after it disappeared. A wool shop, a draper's, an ironmonger with bins of loose nails you bought by weight, a hardware shop that smelled of linseed oil and turpentine, a fishmonger with ice in the window, a pork butcher who made his own pies on the premises, a gentleman's outfitter that had been fitting men from the same families for 40 years, a record shop with a listening booth, a travel agent staffed by someone who had actually been to the places in the brochures, a shoe shop where a man measured your child's foot with a Brannock device before anyone went near the stockroom. The department store sat at the top of most high streets like a full stop. Lewis's in Liverpool, Rackham's in Birmingham, Kendal Milne in Manchester. Not London luxury. These were stores for ordinary people, with a restaurant on the top floor where you could get a pot of tea and a toasted tea cake brought to your table by a waitress in a black dress, and where your nan could spend an hour looking at fabrics without anyone hovering. She had all day, and so did the shop. Above many of those shops, the owner lived. This mattered more than it sounds. When the man who ran the hardware shop lived above it, and had lived on that street for 20 years, the shop was not a unit in a portfolio. It was his livelihood, his home, and his reputation in a single building. He swept the pavement outside it on a Saturday morning, because it was his pavement in every way that counted. The relationship between the shopkeeper and the street was one of mutual dependence, and that dependence produced a kind of care that no retail management consultant has ever successfully bottled. 7 butchers on one street. By 1971, according to the Census of Distribution, independent retailers accounted for over half of all retail sales in Britain. Butchers, bakers, greengrocers, fishmongers, tobacconists, newsagents, hardware dealers, the majority of what Britain bought, it bought from someone who owned the shop they were standing in. On one small high street in Windsor in the early 1960s, a survey found 7 butchers, 7 greengrocers, and 9 grocery stores. Not chains, individual shops, each with its own suppliers, its own recipes, its own version of what a good piece of meat or a fresh loaf should look like. Competition between them was real and immediate. If the butcher on the corner started giving short weight, he knew about it by Thursday. Word travelled at street speed. The delivery system that supported those shops is worth a moment's attention. In 1970, international stores would take your order on a Tuesday and have it at your door by Thursday. The co-op ran a dividend scheme, the divvy, that gave a percentage of your spending back to you every quarter, and members tracked their dividend number the way a later generation tracked loyalty points, except that the divvy actually paid for things. The milkman, the baker's roundsman, the Corona lorry that swapped your empties for full bottles on a Friday. The high street didn't end at the shop front. It extended into the street and into the house, and the people running it were embedded in the neighbourhood in a way that made the whole system self-reinforcing. The law that let the big ones win. the supermarket did not arrive in Britain like a conquering army. It arrived slowly and was for a long time genuinely useful. In 1950, there were around 50 supermarkets in the whole of Britain. By 1961, there were 572. By 1969, 5 years after resale price maintenance was abolished, the law that had stopped shops undercutting each other on branded goods, there were 3,400. The abolition of RPM in 1964 was the first major policy decision that tilted the ground. Overnight, large retailers could use their buying power to offer prices that small shops structurally could not match. The legislation was presented as being good for the consumer. It was good for the consumer in the short term, and devastating for the places consumers lived in over the following decades. Through the 1970s, the supermarkets were still mostly in town centres, still part of the high street ecology even if they were changing it. The Sainsbury's or the Fine Fare was on the same street as the greengrocer and the ironmonger. It drew people in, and some of those people walked past the greengrocer on the way. The damage was real, but the patient was still standing. What finished the patient was not competition, it was geography. The day 120,000 people stopped going to town. On the 2nd of March, 1976, Brent Cross Shopping Centre opened in North London. It cost £20 million, took 19 years to plan and build, and was covered in the press with a mixture of excitement and unease that, in retrospect, got the proportions exactly wrong. It had 75 shops under one roof, air conditioning, late opening hours, and free parking for 5,000 cars. The Prince of Wales cut the ribbon. Journalists called it futuristic. A few called it soulless. The soulless ones were right, but the futuristic ones won. What mattered about Brent Cross was not what it offered, but what it removed. On the day it opened, it drew 120,000 visitors. Those were not 120,000 new shoppers who had previously been sitting at home. They were 120,000 journeys that would otherwise have gone to town centres. From its first morning, the model worked by extraction. It did not create retail activity. It relocated it, away from the streets where it had been embedded in community life, and into a controlled environment owned by a property company whose relationship with the surrounding area began and ended at the car park barrier. The high street had been built around walking distance. Everything about it assumed that you would arrive on foot, and that the journey there was part of the point. The shopping centre was built around the car, and once you were in a car, the logic of walking distance no longer applied. You could go anywhere, and if anywhere offered free parking, warmth, and everything under one roof, the high street's only remaining argument was that it was where you happened to live. For a growing number of people, that stopped being enough. Free rates, no rules, and a steelworks car park. What followed Brent Cross was not the market deciding. It was government deciding, repeatedly and specifically, in ways that made the outcome almost inevitable. In 1979, a new administration arrived persuaded that planning regulations were obstacles to enterprise rather than protections for communities. Enterprise zones were created across post-industrial areas, offering relaxed planning rules and a 10-year exemption from business rates. The stated purpose was industrial regeneration, new factories, new jobs in places gutted by the collapse of steel and coal. The actual result, in several of the most significant cases, was shopping centres built on enterprise zone land by retailers who had no intention of building anything else, paying no rates while their competitors on the high street paid full ones. The most instructive example is Merry Hill in the West Midlands. The Dudley Enterprise Zone was approved in October 1980, following the closure of the Round Oak Steelworks at Brierley Hill. The Richardsons, a local development family, began building a shopping centre on the site in 1985. By the time it was fully open in 1990, Merry Hill had 1.5 million square feet of retail space, 10,000 parking spaces, and had paid no business rates for a decade. Major retailers looked at the numbers and made a straightforward calculation. The same square footage at Merry Hill cost less to occupy than a high street unit in Dudley, 2 miles away. Marks & Spencer moved, BHS moved, Sainsbury's moved, Littlewoods moved. They didn't go bust. They walked down the road to somewhere the government had made cheaper. Within 5 years of Merry Hill reaching full capacity, an independent study commissioned by the Department of the Environment found that the number of visitors to Dudley Town Centre had fallen by 70%. 7 in every 10 people who had previously come to the town had stopped coming. The shops that remained were not competing for a slightly smaller share of the same market. They were competing for the small fraction of trade that had stayed behind after the extraction was complete. Alan Caswell had run the arcade toy shop in the Fountain Arcade in Dudley for decades. Within 2 years of Merry Hill opening, he closed one of his shops and let 3 members of staff go. His neighbour Laurie Fiennes ran the Castle Sports shop in the same arcade. As trade dried up, he fell behind on his rates and bailiffs arrived to seize his stock. When he closed for the last time, he painted a message on the windows. He had paid his rates for 30 years, he wrote. Merry Hill had paid none for 10. The council that had pursued him for arrears had waived them entirely for the development that had made his business unviable. Merry Hill was not the only one. The Metro Centre opened in Gateshead in April 1986, financed in part by the Church Commissioners of England, the body responsible for the financial upkeep of the Church of England's mission in local communities, investing in a development that demonstrably weakened those communities. Meadowhall opened in Sheffield in September 1990 on the site of the Hadfield Steelworks. The same story, the same mechanism, the same result. The planning guidance that gave developers a decade. At the centre of all this sat a piece of planning guidance called PPG 6, Planning Policy Guidance Note 6, published in 1988. Most people have never heard of it. It determined the shape of Britain's retail landscape for the next decade. Rather than directing new retail development toward existing town centres, PPG 6 told local authorities they could not use the planning system to inhibit competition. In practical terms, this meant that if a developer proposed a retail park on agricultural land outside your town, and you tried to refuse it on the grounds that it would destroy your high street, you could be, and often were, overruled on appeal. Dudley's own planning officers warned specifically that Merry Hill's expansion would damage the town centre. Neighbouring councils challenged it. They lost. The guidance was eventually revised in 1996, introducing what became known as the sequential test, the requirement that developers demonstrate they had genuinely considered town centre sites before applying for out-of-town permission. By the time that revision arrived, the Confederation of British Industry estimated that nearly 1,000 out-of-town superstores had already been approved. France introduced equivalent protections in 1973, more than 2 decades earlier, under the Loi Royer. Germany's planning law had restricted large out-of-town retail since the 1970s. Both countries have substantially more active town centres today than Britain does. The comparison is not complicated. The 7th day that quietly finished them. In August 1994, the Sunday Trading Act came into force. Large stores could now open on Sundays. The legislation was popular and the arguments for it were straightforward. People should be able to shop when it suited them. What it did to the independent retailer was less straightforward. A small family-run shop that had built its week around 6 days of trade, with the owner working every one of them, now faced a 7th day on which the large stores were open and pulling footfall from the town centre without any corresponding obligation for the small shop to also be open. Many tried to extend their hours. Most found that the income from Sunday did not justify the cost of the extra day and the exhaustion it produced. The wider effect was subtler. Sunday had historically been the day when people walked into town not to shop in earnest but to browse, to be on the street, to have a look around. The big stores absorbed that browsing. The smaller shops, often shut or quiet on a Sunday, lost the casual foot traffic that had previously drifted past their windows and occasionally come in. The closure that everyone of a certain age felt personally happened between the 27th of December 2008 and the 6th of January 2009, when all 807 Woolworths stores in Britain shut their doors within the 11 days of each other. 27,000 people lost their jobs. The company had entered administration on the 26th of November. By January it was gone, and every high street in Britain had the same hole in it simultaneously. Woolworths had been on British high street since 1909. Its particular genius was that it had never quite decided what it was, part toy shop, part record shop, part hardware store, part newsagent, part sweet shop, and this turned out to be exactly right for the high street because the high street itself had never quite decided what it was either. You went to Woolworths the way you went to the high street, without a specific errand, in the reasonable confidence that you would find something you needed or wanted or hadn't known you were looking for. The pick and mix counter with its little plastic scoops and its rows of compartments was there from 1931. The record racks where you flicked through albums on a Saturday afternoon. The photo booth by the door. The school stationery in September that cost next to nothing. At Christmas, Woolworths was where working class families bought a significant portion of what went under the tree because it was cheap enough to actually afford and present enough not to be embarrassing. By 2008, the company had been weakened by debt taken on during a management buyout, undermined by out-of-town superstores selling the same cheap goods in larger volumes, and finally finished by the credit crisis cutting off the supplier credit it depended on. The government that year committed hundreds of billions of pounds to stabilising the banking system. The question of whether a similar intervention might have saved 807 town centre shops and 27,000 jobs was briefly discussed and quietly dropped. By August 2009, more than 300 of those former Woolworths sites were still empty. The yacht was still there when the jobs were gone. The destruction of the high street was not only a policy failure, it was also, in some cases, a transfer of wealth from the people who worked in those shops to the people who owned the companies that operated them, conducted with a thoroughness that parliamentary committees eventually described in language they rarely use about legal activity. Philip Green bought British Home Stores in 2000 for £200 million. In the years that followed, while BHS still had a functioning pension fund, Green's family received dividends of around £400 million from the business. By 2015, when he sold BHS for £1 to a man named Dominic Chappell, who had been bankrupt 3 times and had no retail experience, the pension fund had a deficit of £571 million. When BHS collapsed the following year, 11,000 people lost their jobs, and the pension deficit threatened the retirement income of 20,000 scheme members. A parliamentary select committee described Green's conduct as the unacceptable face of capitalism. He was eventually asked to contribute to the pension fund and paid £363 million, a sum that left him considerably wealthier than he had been before the purchase. His yacht, photographed extensively during the parliamentary proceedings, remained where it was. Green was not a unique case. He was an extreme example of a structure that the privatisation of retail property and the financialization of retail companies had made routine. The shops on the high street were no longer primarily places where things were sold. They were assets on balance sheets, vehicles for extracting value, and when the value was gone, the shops were gone with it, and the street they had stood on was left with a vacancy. 35 closures a day. The figures that describe the contemporary British high street are not difficult to find. In 2024, over 12,800 chain stores closed across Britain, roughly 35 a day. Since 2015, more than 6,700 bank branches have shut, representing 68% of all branches that existed a decade ago. In some towns in the North and Midlands, approaching 1 in 4 retail units stands empty. The businesses that have moved into the vacated spaces follow a pattern so consistent it has become a cliché. A betting shop, a vape shop, a discount retailer, a charity shop, and at least one unit with brown paper across the windows and a letting agent's board outside. What has replaced the productive variety of the 1970s high street is not nothing. It is something specific and considerably worse, a landscape of businesses that take money out of the local economy rather than circulating it within it, staffed by people on contracts that would have been unrecognisable to the shopkeepers of the previous generation, paying rates on premises that are worth a fraction of what they were in buildings whose upper floors are either empty or converted into flats. The elderly woman who used to walk to the high street every morning for her bread and her paper, and 5 minutes of conversation with someone who knew her name now orders online or doesn't bother. The teenager who would have got their first Saturday job behind a counter has fewer places to apply, and the ones that remain offer 0 hours contracts, and no one who will teach them how the till works or why you always face the tins. The man who ran the shoe repair shop for 40 years locked the door when his lease came up and didn't find anyone willing to take it on. The high street asked something of you. It asked you to get dressed, leave the house, walk somewhere, be in public, and talk to people who were not your friends or your family. It placed you on the same pavement as people of different ages, different backgrounds, and different circumstances, all of them doing the same ordinary thing of buying what they needed for the week. It gave elderly people a reason to leave the house, and a destination when they did. It gave children a place to learn how to behave in public, how to ask for something politely, how to wait their turn and say thank you. It gave the woman behind the counter a name and a face, and a detailed knowledge of what every family on her end of the street needed, and when they were going to need it. None of that was designed. Nobody sat down in 1930 and decided to create a social infrastructure out of a row of shops. It emerged from the cumulative effect of the same people going to the same places over long periods of time and once it was gone it proved impossible to put back together because the conditions that had produced it, the density, the habit, the permanence, the face-to-face dependency, had been replaced by conditions that produced something else entirely. The blank shopfronts on the high street are not, as is sometimes suggested, simply the result of the internet or changing consumer habits, or the inevitable logic of modernity. They are the result of specific decisions that could have been made differently, were made differently in comparable countries, and that the people who made them in Britain chose not to revisit until the damage was irreversible. That is not a market outcome. It is a policy outcome, and the distinction matters because policy can be changed, whereas what it has already destroyed cannot be. If you remember your high street from those years, the shop, the person behind the counter, the thing that was there and is now gone, put it in the comments. Those details are worth more than any planning document. Please subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive.